Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week, as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, the rise of state censorship, the Rwanda migration plan, and Wimbledon's ban on Russian tennis players. Britain seems to be becoming a more censorious country every day. Increasingly, we're seeing people being arrested and even imprisoned for expressing offensive opinions. So this week, a man called Paul Buschetti was sent down for 10 weeks for sharing an offensive video of the Grenfell Tower. Tom, what have you made of this case?
It's a bit of a blast from the past, this one, because it relates to a video that was circulated in 2018, where, as you say, this gentleman and his friends at a fireworks party were burning an effigy of Grenfell Tower. In the video itself, you can also hear people making racist comments, and it was distributed in private WhatsApp groups. It ended up going up on YouTube, went viral, and as a consequence of this, he was charged under the Communications Act with essentially sending a grossly offensive video. Originally, he was acquitted, but so this is a kind of overturning of that original ruling. But it's interesting because these sorts of stories aren't new. We've been talking about them for a very long time. They've been piling up, but I just don't think we should let any of them get away from us. I mean, I think it's fair to say that this gentleman and probably his friends are prize dickheads, but it shouldn't be illegal to be a prize dickhead in my view. And these stories are just mounting up. I mean, we've talked a bit about them on the show in recent years, but particularly under this piece of legislation, the Communications Act, there have just been scores and scores and scores of cases of people either actually being sent to prison or, as in this case, kind of narrowly avoiding it for sending what is deemed to be grossly offensive. A term which is so vague, it's open to almost any form of interpretation. And whilst there's actually, in the online safety bill that we're going to talk about in a little bit, this particular provision is going to be repealed. It looks like it's going to be replaced by a measure which would be potentially even worse. But this is just what we've got used to in this country, unfortunately. We do live in a country in which it's potentially illegal to make offensive, in some cases like this, genuinely offensive jokes and comments. And I think we just can't get used to that, really, although it feels like we have, you know.
As you say, Tom, it's not a one-off. I mean, even in recent weeks, we've had, teenagers who sent racist tweets using the N-word, given prison sentences. I mean, again, this is offensive, but in a free society, we're supposed to have the right to be offensive. Equally, there was a man in Scotland who sent rude tweets about Captain Tom, mocking him on his death, and he was just spared a jail sentence. I mean, Ella, as well as this, we're also getting people tangled up in, under various hate speech laws. There are non-crime hate incidents. It seems as if everything, every area of speech is now being policed by the actual police.
Yeah, and the whole point about judging what is grossly offensive is that it's obviously subjective. So, I mean, there are some, like the video of the burning the Grenfell Tower effigy. I mean, I would think it would be hard pressed to find someone who didn't see that as very unkind at the best. But there have been incidents of, I remember seeing a picture of two girls going to a fancy dress party dressed as the Twin Towers. And, a lot of, as we know, with the whole saga about Jimmy Carr's joke recently, the whole nature of a lot of comedy is that it does push the boundaries sometimes, and sometimes it steps over them. But the idea that it should be made illegal seems strange when, if something is said or done that is offensive, what does making it illegal do? There's this sort of very infantile approach to the law, which we're beginning to develop, that's suggesting that every time you feel hurt by something, you need to find a lawyer or a judge to solve your problem, rather than either interacting with that person or ignoring it. And that has real ramifications, bringing in the kind of very clunky and slow and punitive legal system into what is the social realm of how we interact with each other. I remember saying it at the time, I think we actually discussed it on a podcast back then, is that has no one ever been to Lewis Bonfire, which is this very archaic old bonfire ceremony down in Sussex, where they burn all kinds of effigies. Lewis has a checkered past, let's put it that way, particularly when it comes to racism. But people go and they get offended, but they, no one dies, unless they stand too close to a firecracker, and it's all fine. And there's a similar there's an adult approach to it, which is, I think, lacking in these cases of it's often not necessarily that the people who suffered in the Grenfell tragedy were forefronting this. I remember looking at the story, and actually a lot of the outrage was caused by people online who, maybe were showing solidarity with the Grenfell victims and their families, but there was this kind of desire to cook up outrage completely unlinked to what actually happened in that tragic event. So it's just all a bit childish, because you think, what really is going to happen if you make all of this illegal? Do you think people are going to start being nice to each other? That's not how social interaction works.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things about censorship, isn't it? Is that it's kind of emotionally comforting to feel like you're doing something in relation to this tragedy or in relation to the scourge of racism in general. But what does it actually achieve? I mean, Julia Hartley-Brewer, friend of the show, made this point on Twitter yesterday, which is to say that, no one has faced justice over their role in the cladding scandal, which led to the horrors of Grenfell Tower. And yet there's something almost emotionally satisfying about this particular individual, having his own brush with the law over this. I think this particular case and others like it also raise really deeper concerning questions about private speech as well, because there's this really wobbly line appearing, especially when you're talking about kind of online communications. Because in this case, this particular video, there's actually two, and there's some discussion in the trial as to which one it was. But anyway, were, as I say, circulated in private WhatsApp groups, and then it ended up being put on the broader internet. There was also a case last year, which I think we also talked about, where you had one gentleman basically making a racist video about Priti Patel. He posts it to like a private Snapchat group, and then someone he knows reposts it to another private Snapchat group, and then somewhere along this line it ends up on the broader internet. And then both of them, incidentally, the one who made it and then the one who just passed it on, ended up actually going to prison in that case. I think it was 10 and 6 weeks respectively. Here you have this really fuzzy line between private and public speech as well. Now, obviously up in Scotland, they've already completely eroded that boundary with their hate crime bill, but still, it just shows how this kind of creeping authoritarianism is getting more and more serious, and how, interestingly, I know we're going to come on to this, the fact that you have a Conservative government which is increasingly trying to kind of lean in to some of these issues around freedom of speech, to a certain extent, around the idea that certain things that you can't say, the need to push back for liberal values against the kind of, a liberal left and all the rest of it. But when push comes to shove, they really don't mean it. They like it for a bit of culture war panto. But when it comes to the principles involved, they're nowhere near as, they're nowhere to be seen on these questions, definitely.
Yeah, as you suggest, we have the online safety bill coming down the track. Now, this had its second reading earlier this week in Parliament. There seems to be almost no opposition to it from within Parliament or from within politics. The Labour Party is complaining that it's too soft and doesn't tackle, certain forms of disinformation hard enough. Tom, explain a bit about this bill and how potentially terrifying it is for our freedoms.
Well, there's a lot to it. It's one of those ones that there's so many different kind of concerns and in some cases kind of moral panics which have been attached to it in certain respects. But I think some of the core things that people are deeply concerned about is the duty that's being put on social media firms to clamp down on what is called legal but harmful content, which is quite a kind of Orwellian concept in and of itself. There's also been a lot of concerns raised about the way in which it could affect online encryption, because of the fact that, again, there's a duty for services, even if they're encrypted services, it seems like, to clamp down on even illegal content. But obviously that would imply them creating some sort of backdoor between the two devices that are sharing the encrypted content, which basically means you don't have encrypted content. And it's, again, just part of this panic about freedom of speech online, essentially, that's been raging for some time. Now, obviously, that can be talked about things that are genuinely concerning, whether it's kind of the distribution of threats or content which might be deemed harmful to children. But ultimately, this is about treating all of us like children, about creating more and more pressure on social media firms, essentially, to censor speech. And again, you just have this bizarre cognitive dissonance where you have, particularly the kind of elements of the Conservative Party, at least, will from time to time kind of posturing against big tech censorship. But what they're effectively doing is incentivizing more big tech censorship. It will end up with more of it as a kind of, especially the history of any laws like this in relation to the internet and content, is that it just creates a lot of knee-jerk censorship for the needs of trying to be compliant, and the free speech protections in the bill, such as they are not really worth the paper they're written on. So it's really, really concerning. And I think it's just another example of how free speech has continued to be encroached upon. And whilst, as part of this bill, it looks like the grossly offensive thing from the Communications Act is going, it's being replaced by all kinds of other concerning measures that again, you're seeing opposition to it from outside Parliament, but inside of it is feeble, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a disaster for internet freedom and free speech online.
Yeah, that quite simply, it is a disaster, and there is nothing redeeming about it. I mean, it's been, sort of humorous in a way, depressingly funny, to watch Nadine Dorries and other ministers tie themselves in knots over the last week in the discussion about this. The suggestion that we're going to ask big tech and, online platforms to censor disinformation, but there's a problem because they'll start censoring journalism, and that's a free speech problem. So don't worry, we've put in a provision for an appeals process. And then, you have a minister talking to the Daily Mail this week saying, well, I think we should make, tech giants have an algorithm czar who comes and checks. It's like, Christ, this is like layer upon layer upon layer of bureaucracy.
A lot of it's being made up as it goes along as well.
It's just like pull an idea out of a hat, minister, and go with it. But the problem is it's not benign bureaucracy. It all is adding to this idea that that what we sort of know to be true, that Twitter in particular, but also Facebook for different. It's interesting that different groups in society tend to discuss politics on Facebook and different groups discuss it on Twitter, Twitter being a more kind of middle class zone, that this thing that we understand to now be a public square, more poignantly after the pandemic, and this is where politicians talk most openly, this is where a lot of commentary happens. If you want to know what's going on in the world, you kind of have to be on Twitter. It's where, like the president makes, in previous years has announced policy on there and things like that. That isn't a public square anymore. It's not free, and that actually it's going to be controlled not just by big tech, but governments and czars here and czars there, and it's a nightmare. I think the point about children is really important, and Matthew Lesh wrote an article on Spike about this week, which is that it's a really cynical move by the Tories to try and make this all about children. Nadine Dorries wrote an article for The Telegraph with Rachel D'Souza this week announcing that, the UK is going to be the safest place for kids online. This is all about stopping bullying. And it's not. I mean, it's just a lie to suggest that this is all about making kids safe. I mean, we can have a whole nother debate about the fact that, the idea that bullying will disappear because you make tech giants more censorious is a nonsense. But it's, and Matthew makes this point, it's really infantilizing to suggest that this adult thing that was created by adults for adults, social media and in particular Twitter, needs to be a child-friendly space. It isn't. It's not what it's there for.
Yeah.
And its political worth means that it's an adult space. So not being able to make those differentiations just shows that the Tories are trying to win this kind of cheap populist kind of move of like, oh, it's all for the kids and that we all want to keep the kids safe. And it's really insulting, actually.
I mean, the age verification thing I think is interesting because it just demonstrates also how difficult regulating the internet is. I mean, I'm not saying that you should do it. That's a slam dunk argument against anything, but it's just to say you have a bunch of people who really don't understand how these things work, making policy. And the age verification is a good idea. I mean, it is a good example rather, because this is a kind of rehashing of when they were trying to create age verification for things like porn websites. The idea that they ended up with at one point was that you would go to a newsagent to purchase it, which just, I think, shows the kind of level of technological kind of literacy that we're dealing with, aside from the more principled issues around freedom of speech and everything else.
Did you know that there's tons of brilliant Netflix content out there that you're probably not aware of? And with ExpressVPN, you can unlock all of it. Normally, when you log into Netflix, you can only watch the shows that are made available in the country you live in. But with ExpressVPN, it lets you securely change your online location so that you can access a whole world of content that's available in over 90 different countries. For instance, I used ExpressVPN to watch one of the best films of the last decade, Parasite, which is on Canadian Netflix. Parasite swept the Oscars in 2020, and for good reason. As I wrote for Spiked at the time, it was one of the few Best Picture winners in living memory that really deserved the title. To watch it, all I had to do was open the ExpressVPN app, change my location to Canada, and when I hit refresh, the film was right there. So why choose ExpressVPN over other VPNs? For a start, it's compatible with all your devices, phones, laptops, media consoles, smart TVs, and more. And it's not just good for Netflix, it works with other streaming services too. So for instance, if you're outside the UK, then you can use it to watch BBC iPlayer. And for those of you in the UK, you can use it to access content on Hulu. So be smart. Stop paying full price for streaming services and only getting access to a fraction of their content. Get your money's worth at expressvpn.com/spiked. Don't forget to use our link at expressvpn.com/spiked and you'll get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. So last week, the UK government announced its new plan for migration. The idea is to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to be processed. Now, I think it's fair to say that this policy was met with almost wall-to-wall condemnation. We even had the Archbishop of Canterbury use his Easter Sunday sermon to denounce the plan. It's been denounced by the Labour Party. And even many people within the Home Office, the civil servants supposedly in charge of implementing the plan, have come out against it. I mean, Tom, what have you made of that kind of reaction?
I think the reaction is really, really troubling, regardless of what you feel about the plan itself, which I'm not a fan of. We can get into that. But it was just the kind of the knee-jerk and kind of instant response, which is to say essentially this can't happen. It wasn't just condemning it. I mean, it's fascinating that you've got the church coming out and condemning a government policy. That seems to me a outrageous interference, really. But at the same time, you also have, again, the kind of general legal establishment saying this is going to be held up in the courts. It's never going to happen. The House of Lords naturally threatening to get involved. The response from the civil service, which is almost like they will refuse to work on it and all the rest of it. And I think this is one of the things that it touches on a key issue in the immigration debate that those of us who are in favour of immigration really need to take seriously, which is the fact that to be in favour of people being able to seek asylum here or to just come here to work, I mean, that's one of the great kind of obfuscating things about this discussion is people act as if everyone who's coming on small boats, etc., are refugees. Many of them are economic migrants, and we should be serious about that. But regardless of, even if you support their rights in terms of being able to come here and work here and thrive here and all the rest of it, you have to win that as a democratic argument.
Yeah.
And at the moment, there's just a hiding behind two things, just general kind of moralism, as if to say you're a horrible person if you don't necessarily agree with us. And then again, a kind of recourse to legalism, which is just to say this isn't allowed to happen because of it will be held up in the courts, that it's not going to meet our international obligations in relation to asylum seekers and all the rest of it. And as a consequence of that, you don't have the discussion which is necessary to do something like offer more safe and legal routes, or any, frankly, safe or legal routes for people outside the country to be able to claim asylum, because you're too busy just saying that it's not going to happen, or saying that anyone who supports it is some sort of crazy proto-fascist, which is what we've seen in the past few days. And I think that's part of the problem. And there was one bit in Boris Johnson's speech in Kent, which I think really touched on this particular issue, where he said, there are people who, if you're going to make a case for more immigration, come out and make it, but people are hiding behind, again, some of these kind of these legal hurdles and all the rest of it. And I think he does have a point there, unfortunately.
Ella, I mean, what role do you think sort of Boris and, almost like Boris derangement syndrome and Brexit bashing is playing in this? Because, it was only a couple of years ago when, quite outrageously, the UK Home Office was deporting black British citizens. And I don't recall them saying we're going to go on strike over this, or, this has got to be held up. It didn't cause that much outrage internally, although it did obviously cause public outrage. I don't recall any of the outrage over the many EU migrant policies that we were implicated in when we were inside the European Union. I mean, so it's just an element of, things just get over the top when they involve Boris or Brexit.
I think it's really important to mention Boris's Rwanda policy is pretty much borrowing out of the EU's playbook. I mean, it's not very far from, and you made this point in your article this week, Fraser, about the EU's negotiations with Gaddafi in exchange for kind of lifting of sanctions and a bit of bunging a bit of money here or there. Basically, the institution of Libyan camps where migrants were kept. Gaddafi even basically threatened the EU at one point, blackmailed them, saying, I'm going to turn Europe black unless you send more money. And while that didn't quite happen, as you make the point in your article, they certainly listened to him. There wasn't the kind of outrage that certainly, Welby wasn't the Archbishop then, but the church didn't come out and say anything about that. Similar thing happened in relation to Turkey, with Erdogan being paid in this kind of very sort of backhanded way to erect walls. And that was at the time when Trump was being pilloried for talking about walls and keeping Syrians out. So this is a mild version of what's already been happening in Europe over the last 10, 15 years longer. So that kind of hypocrisy has to be pointed out. But it's also the case that it's a very important issue for lots of people, like it or loathe it, that post-Brexit, and actually this is important, that post-Brexit, the discussion about controlling borders, not closing them or opening them, but having a sense of control over them in terms of not being bound by EU rules, was very important for a lot of people, not just people along the Kent coast. And there, even though I kind of get very frustrated by the hype around how many people turn up in boats, comparatively, it really isn't that much. It is still the case that if you are a nation that has people consistently breaking the rules of coming in through illegal means, you have to do something.
Especially when people are dying in the channel.
Exactly.
But it's just that there's so much disingenuousness going on. Right wingers have been all over the media in the last week talking about the fact that if you don't support the Rwanda policy, you just want to see people drown. And that's frankly bollocks, because if there's lots of other ways you could do it, put on a ferry, put on planes. If the thing you care about is safe routes, put on safe routes. That's obviously not what people care about. What people care about is the question of illegal immigration. And if you wanted to fix that, you wouldn't implement this Rwanda policy. You'd fix the creaking system of asylum that is purposefully made obfuscated and difficult. So a kind of cleanup of the system would do a lot. I mean, the fact that Boris can now go to India and say, oh, well, we need some more workers, so why don't a few of you come along? Which just proves that the whole nature of the way in which they've organized the immigration system, both for economic migrants and for refugees, is just, is based on the whims of who you make trade deals with, which, as I've already said, is how many countries do it. It's how the EU does it. But let's be upfront about that. At the moment, we're having this kind of moral fake battle about whether or not you care about people dying in the sea, when actually there's a much more serious element to this.
I think that the point about Boris's trip to India is interesting, because also the immigration figures for the first year, I guess, of the kind of formally post-Brexit points-based immigration system are in, and immigration's up, I think, by about 25%, might be wrong about that. And of course, it's where we're seeing these sharp rises are from places like India. That's from places where previously it was so much more difficult to come to the United Kingdom, even if you had a lot of family links here, because of the countries that historically we've obviously had a lot to do with, for good and for ill. And I think this is the thing that really gets to grips about this idea that the British public is just really xenophobic and they just do not like outsiders. I mean, people seem to be broadly happy with this particular policy. Incidentally, when YouGov did a snap poll about the Rwanda policy and this kind of outsourcing arm's length approach to the issue of asylum and legal immigration, again, there was actually more people opposed it than supported it. And that was despite the fact that the question seemed to imply, as was kind of implied early on, that this was about, sorting the claims there rather than them actually just being able to apply for asylum in Rwanda and stay there, as it is now being elucidated.
The same thing happened with Windrush. There was that YouGov poll, I remember us talking about it, that said that there was like 70% or more of people were like, what are you doing?
And I think
Don't do this.
And older people more than younger people were concerned about it, but everyone was, obviously. And it just completely gives the lie to the fact that because people want control over borders and they don't like a kind of sense of lawlessness and they don't like a sense of people just being able to leak through the borders and all the rest of it, that doesn't mean that they're anti-immigration. And I think that's something which really needs to be teased out, as well as all the bad faith in this discussion. Because I think Ella's point about, if anything, this is, at least what's on paper here, is a much milder version of what the EU's been doing. The silence of the Remainers on that is crazy. I mean, it wasn't just that they were paying Gaddafi to stop migrants from, in his words, turning Europe black, was the way in which he put it. But when Gaddafi fell, they started paying warlords to do this job. And again, in terms of what's being proposed here, it's miles away from that. But again, I think it just shows the fact, and this is to the detriment of all sides in this debate, I think, it's just become part of a culture war in some respects, particularly with the pro-migration side. It's a way in which they demonstrate that they're a good person, rather than them actually having to convince anyone or make a coherent argument. And that, I think, has really bedeviled our discussion, particularly when, there's a world to win. You have a public that are open to immigration. It's just they don't want it to be something that is decided over their heads and they have no control over.
And finally, let's talk about Wimbledon. So Wimbledon has announced that it's going to ban Russian and Belarusian players from this summer's tournament. It says it wants to limit the influence of Russia. Tom, that's a bit of a pompous statement from a kind of sporting body, isn't it?
Oh, no, it's absurd. I mean, that's the thing about all of these bans and boycotts, whether it's Russian sportsmen or artists or whatever else, is that the fundamental kind of premise of all of it is ridiculous. Like the idea that making sure that Daniil Medvedev can't compete at this year's Wimbledon will shift the dial in any meaningful sense in this war in Ukraine is ridiculous. But it's not just ridiculous, it's vindictive and it's discriminatory and it's really ugly. And you just wonder how we got into a situation in which these kinds of decisions are almost common sense. I mean, the All England Club, the organisers of Wimbledon, are out in front on this issue, if you like. Other tennis tours have just allowed Russian players to compete under kind of on neutral status, essentially. But at the same time, this is something that we've seen across the board. There's just been this kind of like contagion of Russophobia. And it's interesting because on the one hand, people are saying, well, you can kind of understand that there might be this kind of backlash, this kind of overreaction, overcorrection, whatever you want to call it. If you take something like Wimbledon, this is the first time they've ever put kind of nation-specific bans in place since the aftermath of the Second World War, when Germans and Japanese players weren't allowed to compete, all the way through apartheid. South African players could come and play. So this is a new move. And even up until relatively recently, it was kind of understood that on the kind of principle basis, you don't want to conflate individuals with the crimes of their nation or their leadership. But it was also a kind of case that I think there was a sense that you couldn't really be drawn into controversy. You didn't want to be drawn into politics or whatever. Now, a lot of that happened anyway. It's kind of impossible to separate sports from politics in many respects. These people live in the world, they have opinions and all the rest of it. But at the same time, because there is this impetus towards virtue signalling at all times, then these decisions can't help but be politicised. The issue is at this point, to be virtuous is also to be incredibly vindictive.
Yeah.
But that's the situation we find ourselves in, unfortunately.
I mean, Ella, you have someone like Andrei Rublev, I think he's the men's number 8 tennis star, and recently, he wrote on a camera, "No more war." I mean, even someone like that is banned by this policy.
Yeah, but just it shows how superficial it is, which is it's not actually about, and we made this point when all the kind of Russophobia stuff was kicking off a number of weeks ago. It's not actually about taking a principled stand of saying, how can we use this thing, Wimbledon, this sporting event, to send a message, if that's what we want to do, to Russians who oppose Putin and to Ukrainians. What's the best way to do that? And the best way to do that would be to say, look at this guy, isn't he great? Isn't he brave, actually, to do something like that, especially being from a country that is currently, locking up its citizens for opening their mouth about anything in relation to the war. But instead, it's nothing to do with that. It's really about, as Tom says, a kind of virtue signaling exercise in which it takes the lazy option of saying, rather than get into any kind of nuanced discussion about a differentiation between a player and their country, we're just going to ban it. And it benefits no one. I mean, it is really important to say that there has been widespread outrage about this, and people have criticised the official body for deciding to do this. And huge tennis stars like Martina Navratilova coming out and saying, hang on a minute, there have been times in history where things have, nations have acted wrongly, and there has been moral questions at stake. But, sport is meant to be, obviously, on a kind of international basis, whether it's the World Cup or anything, you are representing your country as a player. But there is, that doesn't mean that you sign up to every single policy that your nation holds or the current government holds of that nation. I mean, I'm not comparing Le Pen to Putin at all. I'm not. But say the French election goes Le Pen's way, is every cultural or sporting figure in France then either faced with having to spend all their time coming out and denouncing her all the time, or being just assumed that they're a fan? That's a very sort of stupid way of looking at how people relate to their countries. You don't become a slave to your nation's policies just because you're from that nation. So it's all around a depressing picture, but it is the case that you can't help thinking that there's not just a kind of virtue signaling element to this, but also a kind of real moral cowardice, because while lots of these institutions and bodies have a lot to say about who gets to play in their game, you wouldn't catch them coming out and saying, well, I think we should arm Ukraine more heavily, or like, I think we should, up the Ukrainian fighters, or making any kind of overt political statement like that. So it's a way of sort of covering yourself that you've said something about the war while actually not really saying anything about the war at all.
And Tom, I mean, it's never really a good idea to mix the culture war and real war anyway, is it?
No, not at all. And I think that the combination of those two things has confused a hell of a lot of people, or made them come out and say things that they probably shouldn't in the midst of this particular conflict. It's also worth pointing out that this particular decision also has the kind of dead hand of Nadine Dorries on it. In terms of the reporting, according to the Times, there's been kind of months of negotiation, essentially, or at least discussions between her department, DCMS, and the All England Club in relation to what should happen. Apparently, at one point, and a minister floated this a month or so ago, there was this suggestion that Russian and Belarusians would be able to play, but they would have to first sign a kind of private declaration that they wouldn't express any kind of support for the war or anything particularly provocative in private. And I just think it's really striking that you have moves like this, which is seen as part of us kind of standing up for Western values, for liberalism, for all the rest of it. But it basically amounts to banning people on account of where they were born, and failing that, demanding that they sign some sort of denunciation of their own country. So I think people, the Wimbledon organisers and DCMS, could do well to pick up a history book if that's actually what they think that they're doing in that respect.
But it's also the case that if you get into a situation which you're saying politics can't, you have to sign to say that you won't, I don't know, wear a Z or something that some people have done in some sporting occasions.
That little gymnast.
That if you're saying this isn't allowed, then what happens? You can see people making the argument of, well, then why do the footballers in the World Cup take the knee? Or why did Colin Kaepernick? Why is it okay in that respect? Because, should it be allowed for you to denounce your nation and make a political statement that says you think, they're racist or whatever, or even in the Olympics during the civil rights movement, when people got up and did the fist on the Olympic podium? That's fine. But if you support your nation in no bones about it, anything that's terrible, a Russian invasion of Ukraine, then that's not allowed. Well, isn't the whole point about sport that you have quite solid rules that are fair, and that you don't allow people to make kind of political or subjective judgments? So they're just getting themselves in hot water left, right and centre. Never mind the fact that there is no, as far as I can tell from any of the players, particularly the one who wrote "No More War, Please" on the camera. It's not like there's any danger of anyone getting up in a kind of leotard with a Z emblazoned on it. It's not going to happen.
And I think it's important because there's been a lot of people who would probably usually support, say, our arguments around freedom of speech or boycotts or whatever, who have just, completely flaked on this particular one. Again, because it's kind of emotionally satisfying for them, I guess, to sort of ban Russians in response to, of course, what is a brutal and imperialistic invasion of Ukraine. But it's so important to underline, like the idea of banning that tennis player who wrote that anti-war message on a camera is going to do anything to change this. The idea that how well someone like Medvedev does in Wimbledon this year is going to somehow, again, lend all this esteem to the nation in which he just happens to come from. And at the same time, we are burnishing the Kremlin narrative, which is to say that they don't just support the Ukrainians, the West, they just hate you and they hate me. They hate Russians. They want to see us wiped off the map. That's why they're doing all of this. So if the aim of Wimbledon and its organisers was to prove Putin right on that score, then mission accomplished, I guess.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.